Hey everybody, today we're going to walk through a quick little guide on how to photograph and watch the eclipse safely. For those of you in North America, it will be passing through Canada, US, and Mexico. First off, some safety tips. You might be thinking, hey, we need to protect our eyes, and that is true, but sunglasses, not good enough. What you need are solar glasses. So these solar glasses are actually specially made, ISO certified, for looking at the sun. So if you look through this, it protects from the harmful rays that will hit your eyes. It's pretty cool. You can actually see sunspots and a couple other details. If you're looking for a pair of solar glasses, I'll put a link down in the description below. Now, if you're a photographer out there, you're probably wondering, how do I photograph this safely? I have a Canon R5 right now with a 100 to 500 millimeter lens on there. Now, something you're going to need is an ND filter or a solar filter. This is a 16.5 stop filter, an ND 100,000. Now, that is the minimum you're going to need to safely photograph the sun. What you can do is actually stack a 10 stop and a 6 stop ND, which many of you might have already. Something to keep in mind, an ND is good enough to protect your sensor, but it is not good enough to protect your eyes. So if you have an old-fashioned DSLR with an optics view, if you're trying to look through your viewfinder, your eyes are not protected. So keep that in mind, you need to be safe. Now, if you have a mirrorless camera with an EVF, which is an electronic viewfinder, the viewfinder is a broadcasted video image, so it's not actually looking directly at the sun. So with an ND, you can look at the EVF. If you're looking for an ND like this, I bought an 82 millimeter so I can put it on a variety of my lenses. This uses a 77 millimeter thread, so I just have a cheap newer step-up ring that goes from 77 to 82. I'll put a link down in my description for these two items in case you're looking for something like that for yourself. If you're wondering what size to get for your lens, lenses actually describe the size of filter they can use on the base of your barrel. So you can look at that. In this case, it says 77 millimeter. Your barrel might be something else, 67, whatever it is. You can look at the barrel, find out, use the link, and pick the right size of ND that you need. So first off, I'm going to talk about the different phases of a solar eclipse. Then we're going to go into which gear I recommend, and then last, which settings you should use. There are 5 phases of a solar eclipse. First off is first contact. That's when the sun starts to get blocked out very slowly by the moon. It'll start out by looking like a crescent and work its way towards totality where the whole moon is covered. Second contact, which is the second phase, is when the whole disk of the sun is actually covered by the moon. You'll see a phenomenon that looks like a diamond ring where the edge is going to start to glow. Once second contact begins and that diamond ring effect is seen, there's a unique view called Bailey's beads, which comes up next, which is the light trickling across the edges of the moon and all the different shapes of the landscape. That's then followed by totality, which is that corona effect you've probably all seen a photo of. If you're not in an area of totality, something like Toronto where we're going to get 99%, you might not see that full corona, and what you'll see is that diamond effect come, maybe fade briefly, and then return on the far side of the sun. It's very important to remember that you need your ND on your camera and your safety glasses on your face up to totality. So if totality is not occurring where you are, make sure to keep protection on your face and on your camera. Once totality has occurred, it's basically going to repeat itself in reverse. So we're going to get the diamond effect again, and then the disk of the sun is going to start to clear up, and we're going to start to see the sun again. Again, make sure you have your safety glasses on, your ND on your camera. Totality can range depending where you are. On the edge of totality, it could be something like 60 seconds, where in the middle of totality, it can range for about 4 minutes, roughly, 4.5. So keep that in mind. You might not have very long to work, so it's also important to remember the settings, which we're going to get into. Next up, let's talk about equipment. Again, I have a full frame Canon R5. Any camera will work. Something you're going to want to keep in mind is whether it's a crop sensor or full frame, and I'll get into that in a second. So on the camera itself, I have a 100 to 500 right now. For a nice close-up of the sun, 400 millimeters is usually what people like to use. Now, if you want to get a more environmental shot, you probably want something like 24 millimeters. That can be great, especially if you don't have a zoom, where you can actually do a little bit of a time-lapse effect and blend your photos so you can get a sequence of how the sun is hitting totality and then going back to normal. So even though you might not have the biggest zoom lens, you can get really creative with your photos. It's 4 o'clock, we're out in Toronto at the harborfront. Let's show you an example of how you can actually photograph the sun with an ND filter on a regular day, because it's not going to change too much when the actual eclipse happens. All that's really going to change is the amount of light, so we're going to have to adapt the settings a little bit. So I'm going to put on screen some examples of us actually photographing the sun now. What is handy is for you to have your camera on a tripod. It's also very handy to have a shutter release, so if you have one of those shutter releases, that way you're not touching the camera for camera shake. Or if you don't have that, many of the cameras now actually have the ability to set a 2-second or 10-second delay on photos. So right now I'm using the Canon 2-second delay. Right now we're looking through the viewfinder. You can actually see the sunspots, which is pretty wild, something you probably haven't seen normally. You can use the magnification button on your cameras to zoom in further digitally and check that you're in focus. All the modern cameras are pretty good at picking up the contrast of the sun against the sky, so you should be able to focus on it pretty easily. What some people recommend is once you have focus, you can actually set it to manual focus. That way you don't have to fiddle with it and refocus. But if you have a pretty modern camera, it's pretty quick. I wouldn't stress it too much. We're going to break down the settings into a couple different sections of the eclipse. Now, as far as crop versus full frame, the only thing you need to remember is a crop sensor has a multiplier on the magnification or focal length of your lens. So if I have, say, something like a Canon 7D, which is a crop sensor, if I have a 300 millimeter lens, then it's a 1.6 multiplier for the focal length. So that ends up being, closer to like 500 or whatever. So you need to just keep in mind whatever you're using, if it's a crop sensor, is going to have a multiplication factor. As far as the quality of the image, you're going to get a great shot no matter if it's crop sensor or full frame, so don't stress it too much. The only real impact is the focal length. Next up, depending the model and camera brand you have, the base ISO can really range. So on a Canon R5, the base ISO is 100. On something like a Nikon D850 or other Nikon models, you can actually get 64 as your base ISO. That just means that it can shoot at a lower, more high dynamic range. If you're shooting at base ISO 100, I'm gonna put a table on screen. You can screenshot that, save it, and you'll be able to reference it on the different sections and speeds that you should be shooting at. Whichever base ISO your camera is, I'll show you the different settings you can use. For the sake of this video, I'm just gonna talk about base ISO 100 because every camera has that. The reason we want to shoot at the lowest base ISO we can is the dynamic range of your camera is going to be better, which means that you're going to get a better range of light and colors on your photo. How are we going to shoot the phases? So phase 1, when the sun starts to get blocked very slowly by the moon, this is called first contact, and this is our first phase we're shooting. Now you're going to want to shoot at f8, 1/800th of a second, and ISO 100. Again, if you're at base ISO 64, you may have to shoot a little slower shutter just to get more light into your camera. But as far as those base settings that I just listed, that's a good starting point and should work for most of you. Remember, during this phase, eye protection and ND. This phase is going to last roughly an hour to an hour 15 minutes, so you have plenty of time to shoot. If you're going to be shooting intervals, 5 minutes between shots is probably what you're going to need. If you don't have an intervalometer or a release shutter, what you can do is just put a little iPhone timer down for 5 minutes and then just manually expose every time you need to. Next phase is second contact. That's when the full disk of the sun is now covered by the moon. We're now going to change our settings to f16. We're going to want to shoot 1/1000th, and again at the base ISO. You're going to see the diamond effect start to show up on screen. If you had been shooting intervals, we want to stop that and make sure that we are actually shooting manually here, because you're probably going to need to shoot way faster than your intervals were. Once totality hits, we have to take our filter off. You can take your glasses off during totality to be able to look at it. The brightness during totality has been suggested to be the same brightness as a full moon. So your camera's going to need a lot more light to get a good shot. During this section, we're going to want to shoot at f11, 1/500th of a second, again at your base ISO of 100. This phase can last anywhere from 60 seconds up to 4.5 minutes. So if you're around the center of the eclipse, so around Niagara Falls during the April 8th eclipse, or if you're closer to Hamilton, then it's probably going to be maybe 60 seconds maximum. This second diamond phase is called third contact, and now the sun is about to reveal itself again. This is where we're going to go back to our original settings. Our settings are now going to go back to f16, 1/1000th of a second, ISO 100. You're going to see that diamond effect in Bailey's beads. As soon as that's about to end, we're going to shoot f8, 1/800th f8, 1/800th of a second, ISO 100. Again, this phase is going to last about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, depending where you are. So when April 8th hits, I hope you're in a great spot to be able to see it. So remember, you can see this eclipse from all over North America. Although you may be out of the main path, you can still see a partial eclipse. And the safety tips are important. You should still be able to photograph it, so keep that in mind. Again, there's going to be a link in the description to my tip sheet, the glasses, and the ND filters. So if you're looking to get something like that, a quick little link to Amazon where you'll be able to easily find the gear you need. Hopefully you've learned something. If you have any questions, leave them down below. Give a like and a share, and see you next time. Have fun.